Good morning. We are at the South Carolina Public Service Commission. We are continuing with a second ex parte communication briefing on ND 2025-63-E. This presentation, I believe, is being brought by Dominion. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That is correct.
And present in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Whitfield, Commissioner Brett, Commissioner Caston. Commissioner Belser is on leave, and Vice Chair Williams is presently taking a involved course and will not be joining us. Ms. Westerhill, if you would, please give us the instructions on the ex parte communication.
Yes, sir, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as you mentioned, this is also in non-docket 2025-63E, and it is the presentation today brought to you by Dominion Energy South Carolina Incorporated. It is held pursuant to a notice for a request for an allowable ex parte briefing beginning today at 11 a.m. or upon conclusion of our preceding allowable ex parte briefing. The subject matter of this allowable ex parte briefing is also the same as the previous one, which is voluntary renewable energy programs, community solar programs, standards for interconnection and parallel operation of generating facilities and solar choice tariffs. This subject matter was also noticed by the clerk's office on December 19th. This is a briefing and not a hearing. The briefing must be conducted in compliance with South Carolina law, Code Section 58-3-260, subsection C. The requirements of this statute in part are that an allowable ex parte briefing must be confined to the subject matter which has been noticed. I therefore ask all presenters, commissioners, staff, and all those present to please refrain from discussing any matters not related to the specific topic. The topic again is voluntary renewable energy programs, community solar programs, standards for interconnection and parallel operation of generating facilities and solar tariffs. Second, the South Carolina law prohibits any presenter, commissioner, or commission staff from requesting or giving any commitment, predetermination, or prediction regarding any action by the commissioner or the commission as to any ultimate or penultimate issue which may come before the commission or is currently before the commission. Third, if during the course of this briefing, if anyone fails to conduct themselves accordingly, the provisions of South Carolina Code Section 58-3-260, it is expected that a contemporaneous objection must be made at the same time. Finally, everyone in attendance, if you didn't know, I know you may have signed in initially for the first allowable ex parte briefing. Please do not hesitate to sign in again for this particular briefing because there are separate materials that will be maintained by the clerk's office in regards to this particular briefing. You will also be asked again to fill out a form that will be handed to you. The purpose of this form is to let everyone know, for commission purposes, who was in attendance and that you are certifying that the requirements of the law dealing with the allowable ex parte briefings was complied with and that there was no violation at the time. Mr. Chairman, the neutral designee is still present in the room and all matters, and we are ready to proceed.
Thank you very much. For the record, would counsel for Dominion please introduce yourself?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. My name is Chad Burgess, and I'm appearing on behalf of Dominion Energy South Carolina.
Good morning, Mr. Burgess, and ORS.
Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. Tom Philopoulos here on behalf of ORS, along with my colleague, Claire Benj.
Thank you very much. Mr. Burgess, it's your show.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to appear before you today. DESC has two presenters. I'll introduce these both gentlemen. Danny Cassis. Danny is the General Manager of Strategic Partnerships and Solutions for the company. And to his left is Eddie Folsom, who is the company's Power Markets Strategic Advisor. We have about 20 substantive slides to provide you this morning, and we'll go through those as quickly as we can. I will say I thought Duke Energy did an excellent job recounting the past with respect to the statute. You may hear a little duplicity in that, but if you're like me, repetition is good. and I need to be told things 2 and 3 times before it finally sinks in. So, so hopefully you'll find that helpful. If you have questions, feel free to interrupt us. No worries there. Or if you prefer to hold them to the end, that's equally as good. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Cassis, and I'll let him begin with his presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman and Commissioners. Good to be here again. As Chad said, we won't belabor some of the points that Duke hit on. Those were great, but we'll run through our program, and I will cover the summary, which gives a high level of where Dominion Energy South Carolina is with their Act 236, but then the successor Act 62. And then I'll cover solar choice. I'll cover the community solar summary. I'll briefly cover standards of interconnection. And then Eddie will then cover, Mr. Folsom will cover the voluntary renewable energy program. And we're certainly open to any questions at any time. So really in terms of renewable development and particularly solar, there are really two key components for solar projects to connect to the utility grid. One of the most, they run in parallel really. So one is the rate and the commercial agreement between a customer and how the utility then compensates, net metering or through power purchase agreements. And then in parallel to that, there is the solar interconnection process. So how do we physically allow that system to operate in parallel with the existing utility grid? And so the creation of the economic value and then the physical interconnection are two pieces that have to come together in any renewable program, but they're especially important in South Carolina when it comes to solar. So this is a high-level summary of where Dominion Energy South Carolina is with their current integration of solar into their system. So really the sole resource that's renewable on our system is solar. You'll notice the residential megawatts on a system that has a 5-year system average of about 4,500 megawatts, it's 119. So it's roughly a little over the magic 2% that we discussed or was discussed previously, which was the statutory cap for full retail net energy metering. But you'll notice that's 16,392 systems, so they generally average about 7 megawatts. In the commercial and industrial space, there are 52 megawatts. So actually, in our system, in the commercial and industrial space, the development of renewable energy, what we would describe as behind the meter, is effectively half of what the residential market. And you'll see the number of projects, and you know those are obviously bigger projects. There's more space, there's more roof space with C&I customers, but it shows a clear difference between the amount of renewables that are developed in the residential space and in the commercial. And then maybe most importantly for our utility system, the utility scale projects represent a gigawatt. So that's over 1,000 megawatts. Those are large projects. They are interconnected typically at 74.9 megawatts AC or below. And they represent a resource that's spread throughout our system. It's not concentrated. They look more like mini power plants, if you will, at 74.9 typically megawatts. So, and then lastly, we have our community solar program, which we report on to. That was a statutory requirement, or at least a fulfillment of a requirement in Act 236, where we aggregated what we would call 3 smaller utility scale assets and allowed customers to participate, residential, commercial, industrial, churches, municipalities, schools, and we have a low moderate income component. And we'll show a little later in the presentation how that divides up. So when you total all that together on a system that operates, again, in the 4,500 to 5,000 megawatt range. We have almost 1,400 megawatts of renewable energy on the system. Yep. So every year we do a what we call a renewable energy summary. This repeats a point that Duke made earlier, but I wanted to spend a little time focusing on this. We talked about Act 236 and the desire in Act 236 to create effectively a portfolio of distributed energy resources. And the legislature in approving that piece of legislation, they were clear that there should be some drivers or some catalysts to begin to enable renewable energy. And again, in South Carolina, it was mostly solar. So the original development that took place in Act 236, it was driven by incentives. It was driven by tax credits and what we would describe as maybe even an additional boost with where retail rates were at the time of inception. So the first and second net energy metering programs did have not only a cap, but they had a sunset, a date certain, where those programs would close. We think it was the intent of the General Assembly to incent, but not to perpetuate the incentives that were associated with those programs, and then they would sustain themselves in a way without subsidization. So, what happened is Act 62 followed Act 236, and in that piece of legislation, there was very clear language, which was to eliminate in a successor rate, eliminate any cost shift to the greatest extent possible. And so the requirement to create a successor rate was part of a litigated docket, which is where we ended up with our solar choice tariff. And so you've got a sunset for an old program, and then you've got new adoption on a new program, and then you've ultimately got a shift from customers that were on an old tariff or old rider to a new rider. Yeah, I know that's a tight visual right there, but it effectively shows the options that customers had. And if you look to the right of that slide, net energy metering 2.0, no longer available to new applicants. 3.0, which was really the bridge between the Act 62 solar choice option. And so those are no longer applicable, other than they will ultimately be sunset in 2029. And the solar choice becomes the choice, actually, the main choice or the main economic choice for DESC residential solar programs, although there are two other options for residential, but they generally don't meet any kind of economic standard. Some things about the solar choice tariff that are important. So the way the solar choice tariff is set up, it essentially has the customer going on to, in the residential tariff, time of use rate 5. And so when the solar generator for that customer produces during those periods of the peak rate and they export to the grid, they get compensated at that value. When they generate off-peak and they export to the grid, they get compensated at that rate, 2 different rates. So it's no longer a straight across volumetric rate. And so that was that came out of the order in the solar choice docket, and that's the rate that we've really applied since June of 2021. And so we're going to show some charts in a minute that are going to show what that does, or what that did do to the adoption rate. Give you an example of that rate. I'll have to look down to see this, but the on-peak rate today for time of use rate 5 is 27 cents. So customers, if they consume, it's valued at 27 cents. If they export, it's valued at 27 cents during those distinct time periods. And then off-peak is 14 cents, and that's the value of that asset to the customer. And then there's actually now, in a subsequent rate filing, there's a super off-peak. So it's 9 cents. And so the rate's based on the way the retail rate's set up. So that's netted out. And then ultimately, customers that overgenerate, they accumulate those credits. If they don't use those credits, then in November of each year, they're essentially cashed out at our avoided cost rate. So a good step, I think, in terms of moving towards eliminating any cost shift to the greatest extent practicable. It doesn't eliminate all, but it was certainly a move in the right direction. On the DESC, on the non-residential solar programs, again, the dominant program or the dominant choice would be Solar Choice. So that's a customer using 1,000 kW or less. It marries with our time of use rate 16, and basically it runs the same metrics. The on-peak, 22 cents, off-peak 13, super off-peak 7 cents. And so if you're a smaller, what I would describe as a medium commercial customer, then that would be your choice for non-residential solar. If you were wanting to build a bigger solar asset, then there are two other options. One is the buy all, sell all, not as economically viable in most cases as Solar Choice. And then there's the offset only. So you can build a bigger asset as a for example, industrial customer, and you would be essentially thinking of the compensation as what you're offsetting with your retail rate. So whatever your retail rate was, that's what you're competing with solar. So here's the net effect of what happened after the transition to Solar Choice. So every customer really after June 1 of 2021 became, if you're in the residential market, you essentially move to Solar Choice. So every new adoption moved forward to Solar Choice. In the original statute, the Act 236, full retail net energy metering, it was available through the end of 2025. So on the first day of January this year, all the customers that were in NEM 2.0 also moved over to Solar Choice. And so you can see the transition in this chart. As of today, now in this transition, there are almost 14,000 customers that now take advantage of the Solar Choice tariff, which is really coupling their generator with our time of use rate 5. And then you also have commercial and industrial customers who have also transitioned over. And you'll see the average system sizes for those customers. And then you'll also note that, so that moved over 9,023 customers that were previously NEM 2 customers. So those all move over into Solar Choice, which becomes, really the de facto option for residential and for what we would describe as medium and general service commercial customers. I'm going to give you a visual on that and what it looks like. So you'll notice the yellow line, that's the beginning of Solar Choice, the successor rate. And so the blue line which goes actually, if you extend this chart, it would go all the way back to Act 236. It would go back to 2014. But we just truncated it starting in 2021, the beginning of the year. And then you'll notice the growth or the continued adoption under the solar choice tariff. And it's a fairly linear adoption rate. And then you'll see the drop off right at the beginning of the year where the customers that were in NEM 2.0 were converted over. And so you still have roughly 16,000 residential customers, but most of them are solar choice. That's the residential. This is the non-residential solar. So this takes a little bit of explanation relative to other programs that we created in Act 236. So there were a few additional programs, and they also have the same sunset provisions. So we've ultimately got to shift those over to one of the other three programs that we defined, but the dominant program would be solar choice, which would be the time of use rate 16 coupled with the solar generator. So you'll see the adoption, and I think we've already revealed that commercial activity isn't as robust. They're bigger systems, but they're much more complex and they're of much more value. So the willingness for commercial and industrial customers, at least on our system behind the meter, there's been a limited or less adoption. So one of the reasons, and you'll look at the next program, you'll see the big, you'll see the next line below that after the yellow, you'll see the black. So the black is basically offset. So customers aren't participating in delivery or export to the grid. They're essentially just offsetting their consumption. So they're competing against effectively their retail rate to create their economic value. The green was a program, it's called the Bill Credit Adjustment. It was a program that we created in Act 236. It was designed once we saw that initially commercial adoption would be slower and that residential would be the dominant form of what we call customer-sided generation. We created a program that allowed industrial customers, commercial customers, churches, schools, and municipalities to essentially deliver in front of the meter. And we would pay them what I would describe as an above-market PPA price. And so it allowed those customers to solve their problem in some cases of not having tax liability, therefore couldn't take advantage of the tax credit. But it was also designed to be a program that it had a limited life. It was a 10-year life. So what will happen with those customers is they will also ultimately face a decision where they'll either transition to solar choice or they'll transition to offset, or they can deliver to the utility company through a PPA and continue to deliver in front of the system. And then you'll see those net metering customers, they'll also ultimately drop off and they'll all transition. So in a future proceeding, we could look at this chart and we would generally see almost everybody moving to the solar choice option. All right, I'm going to put a busy one on you. This is one that may provoke some thought and some questions, but this is the entire continuum of our solar development in the residential and commercial space, and that's at the inception of Act 236, signed into law, and it runs out all the way to today, or essentially this month. And so I think this actually tracks well with, I think, some of the comments that Duke made. You'll see in January of 2015, and you'll look for about 6 months, that's post-Act 236. So market's nascent. There's very little bit of activity. So in the legislation, utilities were charged with creating incentives to develop balanced distributed energy resources. And then you'll see the curve almost, I won't say it goes straight up, but you'll see every month. While Duke provided upfront incentives, we created a production-based incentive. It was also in the spirit of Act 236 limited, but it allowed customers to not only take advantage of full retail net energy metering, but they were also able to get an additional 4 cent, 3 cent, 2 cent, or 1 cent based on vintage.
What's the difference between the Duke program and that program?
So it's just a different way to incent. So Duke's program, or one of the things that Duke did to incent adoption, was to provide upfront reduction, essentially, or payments, so that would offset first cost. In our case, we felt like the state tax credit, the federal tax credit, and the current retail rate that we were selling energy to residential customers, and then creating full retail NEM, we would just provide a small incentive to a small group of customers. And once they took advantage of it, that would eventually expire. So we did it just two different ways. I mean, I think we both served our purposes and what we were trying to accomplish. So we were trying to get adoption to really ultimately hit a cap and then develop that distributed energy resource and then move to a different successor rate. Yep. So you'll see you'll see there's a space in there where you'll see a bunch of blue. So that was that bill credit adjustment. That was the driver in the market. Churches, schools, municipalities were compensated at 22 cents per kWh. So they were able to take advantage of it. Again, they didn't have the tax appetite or tax liability. So then that essentially helped that program along. And then you'll run it out a little bit further, and then you'll get to 2019, and you'll hit the curb, and you'll have Act 62, or the Energy Freedom Act. And of course, in the Energy Freedom Act, there was the language regarding the no cost shifts, or limiting the cost shifts to the greatest extent practicable. And so you'll start to see what was a startup market, and then you'll see as that market continues every month that there's adoption. But again, it's primarily driven by the price of retail energy, because that's what the customers are competing against when they install solar, a tax credit, which they were able to take advantage of, and I mean, those are, and then any other incentives that could be out there. State incentives still exist. But what you've got is really a long-run market. And so you'll see the spikes every now and then in the commercial space, but those would generally be one or two larger installations. And there weren't that many projects. And then you'll actually see, like, all the way to the end. Now you'll see almost, I wouldn't say it's flatline, but every month we look at it, and I think you can see it tracks relatively close to where we predicted it would with the current retail rates. And I think the one factor that you probably have that would challenge the market going forward would be the expiration of a tax credit. But you've got a long-run market. It's still 110 megawatts of, and then another 50, I guess. So you've got a decent market, or a decent amount of solar capacity. This is a slide that we've tracked for some time. It really goes back to 20, and you start to see on the very bottom, this is the same tracking, the same solar system and same solar system adoptions, but they're actually tracking back to 17, and you'll start to see at the very bottom, those are residential battery storage systems. So what you're starting to see is customers are recognizing that solar by itself is intermittent, but if you couple it with another resource, then you're able to consume it at site and utilize all the energy instead of just exporting and seeking compensation that way. So while it's, I wouldn't call this robust by any chance. I mean, there are about 800 battery systems that are coupled with the 16,000 or so solar systems. So these are all residential projects. As part of actually Act 236, the company created a community solar program. And we had the benefit, of course, in Act 236 of being able to subsidize or create a construct where consumers ultimately were incented to participate in the community solar projects. So we took 3 projects that were in the queue, and we're going to connect to the system as qualifying facilities, and worked with a developer for 3 different sites to create a total of 16 megawatts AC. So about 20 megawatts DC, 16 megawatts AC. And so if you were a customer that didn't want solar on your roof, or you couldn't site it because your orientation of your roof was poor, or you had an older roof and didn't want the risk associated with putting panels, they could participate in one of these 3 projects. And I would say that we were probably ahead of our time in terms of the development of the program. We had the advantage of being able to create economic incentive through Act 236, but we also recognized that customers were quickly going to essentially fill up and adopt the entire program. So we had 3 ways to really participate for all customers. And this actually, we cut across all classes of customers to be able to do this. So we offered it to really our entire customer base. But you had 3 ways really to participate. You could purchase. We didn't have a huge number of individuals purchase, but we did have some, and they actually got rewarded with the highest compensation as a result of their purchase of their solar panels and those assets. So they earn essentially a return, and they get a credit on their bill. The subscription turned out to be far more popular. It required no money. There's a fee, but it's an ongoing. So you're paying a fee, but you're also receiving compensation for the production. So no out-of-pocket money, but easy. And customers then would be able to see that every month on their bill. And then we actually did a carve-out for select low income, and we were basically able to eliminate any subscription fee, and then they receive a credit. And we actually, as a qualifier, required that anybody that was in the low income portion of the community solar farm, we required that they do energy efficiency, had an energy efficiency audit to ensure that they were limiting the consumption and doing everything they could on the energy efficiency side. And there you'll see the actual breakdown of all the participants. Between the residential, you're close to you're about 900, with most of those being subscription. We did have a lot of municipalities that had premises that they take service from us. Schools were quick to adopt, didn't have the money to purchase, but went through subscription. And then we had a lot of churches that actually went through the program and are still subscribers. So the program's fully subscribed. You'll see the low to moderate income. That was 1 megawatt we carved out, basically about 6% of the project. And so that's fully subscribed, and we actually have a wait list. A lot of people ask the question, well, that sounds like a great program. Could you extend it, or could you grow it? And the short answer is that because of the way we essentially set up the incentives, it created a cost shift to do it any other way, which we could not come up with a methodology then to not create a cost shift. And there was specific language in Act 62. So these are standing assets. They deliver energy, again, to the utility. At the utilities, I mean, the underlying value of those assets are they deliver at avoided cost, but then there's an adder, which goes to the benefit of the customer. But it is subsidized. Yeah, just want to briefly talk about, I thought Duke did a good job on the standards for interconnection and parallel, so we're going to kind of just quickly track the same way. What Duke saw and what Dominion Energy saw, once you started to create the catalyst for renewable development through a program like Act 236, it brought massive amounts of interest. Some very good developers, some developers that we would just describe them as they were speculatively entering into the queue on projects. So it ended up with a massive amount of resource trying to connect to the system, but anybody who would understand math and physics knew you couldn't integrate that much. And we had a very, very old way to evaluate the ability to interconnect. It was done in a serial manner. You did one project and you evaluated it one at a time, and then once that project, you moved to the next project. Very taxing on your resources. So in adopting what almost every other jurisdiction in the United States was doing, we moved to a cluster study. Duke did a good job of describing the cluster study. We first started with our FERC large generator, interconnection protocol. So that was driven by a FERC order. So we moved those projects and established that cluster analysis. But as our transmission folks tell us, you really don't have two queues. You need to move your state generator interconnection protocol also to the same cluster study, so that all the projects get studied at the same time in a certain time window. Costs get allocated as fairly as you could allocate them under this methodology. And so, the commission basically ordered us, I think it was 2019, to review and begin the process. And we took the opportunity to then ultimately have the commission approve our South Carolina Generator Interconnection Protocol for the state queue. So now we're operating under the cluster study. We're not completely finished with our work, so there are still stakeholder engagement that needs to take place, but we felt like it was important to take care of the state generator interconnection protocol so that we would actually have at least that done. And so those projects could be studied efficiently and effectively and fairly. And so that's now underway. You'll have another window that opens, and then we'll start that process and the analysis of how we can safely and reliably connect those resources. So this gives you kind of the order of magnitude that we were dealing. This is a state interconnection queue. This is a summary. So this pulls in everything basically from, I believe, 2013 to 2026. So it's almost 13 years. And you'll see the amount of work that's actually been processed through the queue. But you'll see the amount of work that's currently in progress. And remember, just because it's in process in the queue doesn't mean it will necessarily interconnect. The commercial terms need to essentially make sense for the developer. But you'll also see the massive amount of resource that's actually come through the queue that is actually withdrawn. So they couldn't reach essentially financeability, which shows you the massive amount of work that gets done in the interconnection queue, which was why that was a provision in 62 that was really important to the utilities, because not all we develop projects, right? We self-build in some cases and need to interconnect. And so this was an important piece of Act 62 to get this cleaned up. I would say that there's still work to be done, and there's still existing stakeholder engagement, but we've moved a considerable length from where we were in 2017 and 2018. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Folsom, and he's going to cover the voluntary renewable energy program and where we are.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I'm Eddie Folsom, Power Market Strategic Advisor with Dominion, and I'm here today to give you a brief update on the Voluntary Renewable Energy Program, or what may more commonly be known as our Voluntary Renewable Energy Rider, or the VRE Rider. I thought it would be helpful to start with a little bit of background on this program. This rider has been in effect since mid-2021. It was worked through the normal docketing process, and the completion of that docketing process did include participation of both customers and renewable developers. We worked through the development of this rider, very focused on being compliant with Act number 62 and our PURPA implementation here at Dominion. This rider is available to non-residential customers that have a peak demand or a contract demand greater than or equal to 1 megawatt. And this program is capped at 135 megawatts, so it's available on a first-come, first-served basis in terms of the number of renewable generation supply agreements that may come to be under this program. And I'll give an update on the slide in a couple of minutes about what the current participation level is and have a little discussion on that. Thought I'd go over some of the key components associated with this rider. It was intended to be a collaborative effort between customers, renewable suppliers, and the company. A couple of the primary agreements that have to be put in place under this rider is a contract called the RG Supply Agreement and then a PURPA QF PPA. The RG Supply Agreement is essentially a three-way agreement between the customer, the developer, and the company, where the customer and the developer primarily can agree to whatever provisions they want to agree to that define flow of revenues and things of that nature outside of the PPA. That RG supply agreement is currently limited to 125% in terms of the megawatts for the renewable facility, 125% of the customer's contracted demand. And then the PURPA QF, Act 62 required that the PURPA QF PPA be consistent with the form PPA that's on file at the Commission that's already been approved for transacting with renewable resources for the purchase of power. And then those documents, including the application, are all available on the Commission website or upon request if somebody would like for us to provide them directly. A couple of other items of note. This rider requires that the customer's retail service agreement have the same term as both the RG supply agreement and the PPA, and that just creates symmetry for all of the parties involved and all of the obligations that the various parties are making. And then, of course, Act 62 made it very clear that there was not to be any cross-subsidization or cost shifting in the implementation of this program. So essentially, no costs under this program are to be borne by the company or any other non-participating customers. All right, here's an update on the participation under the VRE rider. Up to this point in time, we've had many discussions with both customers, developers, customers and developers at the same time over the last 4 years or so. And up to this point, there have not been any RG supply agreements or associated PPAs that have been executed under the VRE rider. I've tried to outline a few things here that we think contribute to that and may have made it difficult for folks to utilize this particular program. One of the big events, and Mr. Cassis, or big issues, as Mr. Cassis hit on this earlier, you know, we already have a significant penetration of renewable and solar resources on our system. And the majority of those resources were implemented before this rider was put in place. And I put some numbers here that, you know, basically 1,050 megawatts of the almost 1,200 that we have on our system were already in place before this rider was made available to our customers. And I know you guys have probably heard this in other dockets and heard this concept, but that equates to a pretty strong penetration of renewable and solar resources on a system of our size, about a 5,000 megawatt peak demand system, and we've got 1,200 megawatts of solar, essentially. And whenever you have a large penetration of resources that deliver to your system on a similar energy profile, over time, when you pancake additional resources on top of those resources, that tends to put downward pressure on avoided costs. So anytime we calculate a new avoided cost for a renewable supplier who's interested in participating in this program, they are subject to having all of those other resources ahead of them in the economic stack as we calculate those avoided costs. Of course, the other challenges that I think everybody is aware of is expiring tax credits associated with the development of renewable projects. And then something else that has just been a real issue that we've all had to deal with is, with the greater penetration continuing to develop on our system, we've had to start to implement curtailments on our system to allow us to operate our system in a prudent manner. So these are all uncertainties and all issues that the developers have to deal with. And quite frankly, all of these different uncertainties have just made it challenging in general for developers to commit to new long-term PPAs or contracts, whether it's just a PPA standalone or whether it's as part of this VRE rider. And then from the customer side as well, for most of the customers that we deal with, energy comprises a large part of their budgets and of their business models, and any incremental costs that they encounter as a result of participating in a rider like this is going to affect their bottom line. And kind of what it comes down to is the business models at this point in time of the customers and of the suppliers or the generation developers have not converged. It just has not come together where the program has been a fit. We at Dominion think the structure of our program is good. We think it's reasonable. We just think that as it stands right now, with all the factors in the market and everything customers and developers are dealing with, it just has not been a good fit where it would be something that both customers and the developers would come together on at this point in time. So that's an update on where we are right now. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you both. Any commissioner questions? Whitfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real quickly, I'm not going to get too deep in the details and so forth as we did just here in the Duke program, and I know they're different, but kind of a more general questions for maybe for both of you. I think I heard Mr. Folsom, you say that about 1,200 megawatts subscribed and for total out of a total of 5,000 company wide. Of course, the 1,200 you're talking about is just the utility scale or large industry, right?
That's correct.
And so when you add that number together, I believe I heard Mr. Cassis say 1,359. One of his slides said 1,359 in his slides, and on 4,500 total. And I did a little quick calculation of that, and that comes up to about 30%. If I'm figuring that right, is that right, Mr. Cassis? Possibly.
Yep, I think that's close to 30 of the system. I'll let you ask the question. I don't want to jump the gun.
Right, and so that being said, where we are, as you stated today, where would you say we were, or where did where was our starting point when Act 236 was passed in 2014? Obviously, we're somewhere way below 2%, but where would you say we were? Where did we start? What was our starting point?
We were very close to zero.
Very close to zero. That's kind of what I thought. So now you're at, fair to say, almost 30%, which is quite a penetration level company-wide.
It is. It's been a challenge to integrate that much resource. I think with really the idea being that just because it has nameplate capacity, it's intermittent. It's not dispatchable. And I think that's part of what our challenge is actually dispatchable resource.
And I'm going to follow up with a question on that very word right there in just a second. So it's fair to say that you've done this in about a 10, 11, 12-year period with the most accelerated portion of it being since Act 62 was implemented in 2019. It really became accelerated after that. So still in roughly a decade, with the last part of that decade being kind of accelerated, I guess is a fair way to say it, right?
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Folsom, back to the dispatchable word, and again, I'm asking this in a general nature. Do you believe that as battery storage is implemented and comes online, it's in scale here in this state, will that help you? You mentioned, I think you used the word curtailments. Will that help you? And I realize that most of those systems, as they're deployed, only have so many hours of storage, but could you describe how that may mitigate some of the curtailments or help you or help the system?
You know, that's a great question. And at a high level, I would agree that the more dispatchable storage we have on our system, it could offer our system controllers some additional flexibility as they figure out the most appropriate way or determine if we have to issue curtailments. But I think it remains to be seen, as you said, how folks can actually bring storage to our system and actually get it financed, get it implemented on our system, and also how the contractual provisions developed as to whether Dominion's able to control those resources or whether they would be controlled by the folks that own the batteries. But at a high level, I do agree that there is potential for the existence of battery storage to support that issue.
Mitigating some of that, or you used a word that sends a little alarm bell. The word uncertainty is not obviously not a word that we want to hear. You know, we want to hear a lot in the utility regulatory world, but if you can mitigate that uncertainty, and I realize you've had some challenges with that, but if you're able to dispatch and mitigate the curtailments, mitigate that uncertainty, I think we all sectors or ratepayers want certainty. We all want certainty that that system's going to work.
And just to make sure my intention was clear, I don't really see at this point, and I don't think this is what you took from what I said, by the way, but I don't see at this point where the implementation of battery storage would completely eliminate the need for curtailments on our system. But if it did come together in certain ways, it could be one tool that would help it in some fashion. But to the degree to which that would help at this point is still not known.
Thank you for your presentation. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Caston.
And I believe my question is within the confines of this topic, and Mr. Philopoulos will let me know if it's not. Stop me before. But I guess building on what Commissioner Whitfield was asking, you know, I heard the, you know, talking about when you have too much solar, you need to curtail. And I guess in the winter when you need it, you don't. And I understand the storage, which is still somewhat limited, but I guess relative to dispatchable that you mentioned, has the increase currently, and will it, if it increases more, is it requiring or will it require more dispatchable derivatives such as that to compensate for the additional solar?
So I'll answer it like this. I think that so we're obviously going to file an integrated resource plan at the end of this month, and I think we're a big believer, and we've stated it previously in other IRPs that we're at all the above in terms of resource, but you think of all of the above first with what's creates the most affordable energy, but also what creates the most reliable energy. And I think those two are the cornerstones for building a plan. And if it requires dispatchable resource to ensure that your customers have reliable service, then that's what the company will focus on in terms of creating the best plan, the resource plan. But there is value. I would never dismiss the value that, for example, solar or solar plus storage, but the system has to work. It's almost like an orchestra. It's got to work together, and it's got to balance in order for customers to get the energy they need during the peak periods.
I understand if you can't answer this, it's okay, but something that's concern might be the right word for me to use, but at what point is there a break point to where it becomes a net positive effect to where it's requiring more dispatchable at a cost that exceeds the value of having it?
So again, it's about balance.
And that's
a
the
fair
IRP
question.
still?
No, it's a fair question. So so the way the assets operate, I mean, they're not getting, many assets don't get built unless they can create economic certainty, get financed. But I think without, with the concern, for example, Mr. Folsom brought up the concern about curtailment, for instance. There's got to be a way to mitigate that for developers. And I think that's what kind of creates the balance. If there's more load and there's a place for the energy to go, it's fine. But I don't think you can just have unmitigated development without understanding, as our system planners and our operators do, the balance that's required to deliver the energy. But one of the greatest risks for curtailment in solar is during the shoulder periods. It's in the Aprils and the Mays, and it isn't hot yet, but it isn't cold. And the systems are running, the generating assets that we own are running, but you can't turn them off, some of them, or some of them you want to turn on, you can turn them on quickly. But it's that balance, I think, that is getting created, and that's where you see a lot of the curtailment. But I will say, we do curtail solar when we have to, because sometimes there's no place to put the energy, and you have to continue to run some of the units to keep the service reliable.
Thank you so much. Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate the presentation.
Thank you, Commissioner Caston. Commissioner Britt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I, too, appreciate your presentation, along with Duke's and Dominion, the time you all put into this, because it's been very, very helpful to me. Just two quick questions. That, Commissioner Whitfield, in his math, he pointed out about 30% of the megawatts generated for y'all are coming from solar. Is that right?
So it's let me I'm going to unpack that a little bit if I can. So that's the rated capacity. So when all those assets are producing, typically the solar profile at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, if today's a sunny day, I can't see, but if those assets are at peak production, then they're going to be generally at that capacity. If we get cloud cover, they're going to be less than that.
How much less?
So I will say this. On February 1st or February 2nd, early in the morning at 6 a.m., the answer is almost nothing.
Okay.
Which is, so the curve looks just like it's like a bell curve. And it peaks, doesn't always peak with the utilities system. And I guess that's why I was leaning on when Commissioner Caston asked his question. I was leaning so hard into this. It takes everything. So individual and discrete assets are good, but collectively, the system is much better when all the assets are operating and you're balancing.
And I could feel the angst as you were making your presentation and your comments, both of y'all and Duke as well, because this, where we are today, you know, March the 10th, 2026, is different than where we were in 2014 or where we'll be, you know, 5 years from now. And this is my last question. I mean, do you see solar being an affordable and reliable energy source in the next 5 years or 5 years out compared to other sources that are coming?
And is that a reference to customer sided or
just energy, you know, generation period, whether it's SMRs or whatever? All the talk that's out there about all these new energy sources that the government and all these private companies are investing in.
I would say, yeah, I would describe solar. I would describe solar plus storage. I would describe those resources as important. I think in Duke's presentation, they made a very good point. Solar by itself generally isn't considered to be a capacity resource, which is by definition something you can call on it and it's there. It's actually limited by effectively the sun. And I think that's, so there is value. It likely will be a good energy value, but I'm not sure it's a great capacity value, because when the system needs it and the customers need it, it isn't always available. I think if you couple it with storage, for example, it starts to become a capacity resource, but it has its limitations. It isn't, full adequacy around the clock. Could be a 4-hour duration product. Sometimes you need more than that. But
what does a battery energy storage facility cost?
So you're for a megawatt for 4 hours, we'll further actually file our integrated resource plan in the next 2 weeks, and it will show in that plan, it will show the number. We use the NREL data or we use actual construction data, but the historical number that we've seen is it's over $1 million per megawatt for 4 megawatt hours. Generally, that range is probably a little higher. I think battery storage under the current federal policy has retained some benefit for tax treatment, whereas solar, at least now, doesn't or only will retain benefit if you make the investment before certain dates by U.S. Treasury guidelines. So there is, we'll show that in our evaluation and our integrated resource plan as to how cost competitive it will be.
So $1 million for a megawatt for 4 hours storage.
For 4 hours of duration.
All right.
Yes, sir.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Commissioner Britt. Any further commissioner questions? Gentlemen, thank you very much. Anything further from the company?
No, Mr. Chairman.
ORS.
Nothing from ORS. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. It's been a long morning. We are adjourned.